Hello, and welcome to Continuing Education, a podcast for homeschooling families with actually useful information. I'm Heidi, and today we're going to be doing our June news and research roundup. We're going to talk first about two homeschool laws for two different states that we've kind of been following. Some things were passed. Very interesting in how those directions are moving. And then also we'll take a look at some interesting brain and learning studies that can matter for how we teach our kids at home. Here's the thing, and the reason that I kind of talk about this and why I like to do this news and research stuff is while we're kind of juggling math lessons and signups and the day-to-day of homeschool, lawmakers are quietly shaping the landscape that we're homeschooling in. And so I think it's worth knowing about these kinds of things, whether it's in your state or not, and being on the lookout in your own state to see how this might impact you and advocate for the things that you want to have in terms of homeschooling environment. So we're going to hit on two big national stories from the last few weeks, then pull out some practical research-backed ideas you can try with your own kiddos without turning your house into a lab. Story number one is Connecticut passes its first statewide homeschool oversight law. We've been watching this for a little bit. In late May, Connecticut's governor signed House Bill 5468, an act concerning the provision of parent-managed learning. He signed it into law as part of Public Act 2637, and this is being described by the Coalition for Responsible Home Education as the state's first formal step into homeschool oversight in a state that previously had almost no statewide homeschool regulation. And you may recall that this seemed to happen after a couple of high-profile child neglect, and sadly, I believe that a child passed away from a family who under the guise of homeschooling. Under this law, parents who choose to homeschool must submit a form declaring their intent, and the state will maintain a registry of homeschooled children. Families will also go through a one-time check to make sure no household member has an open case with the Department of Children and Families or is listed on the Child Abuse or Neglect Registry. Earlier drafts of the bill, we've talked about this before, had to kind of propose annual education assessments and more extensive documentation, but lawmakers really scaled those pieces back before passage, which I think is actually kind of a nice compromise. For Connecticut families, this means that homeschooling is still legal, it's still available, but there are now a few extra steps at the front door: that required notice and a background check step that didn't exist before. Advocates who pushed for the law say that it closes gaps where severe abuse cases had kind of slipped through the cracks. Essentially, while critics, including the HSLDA, which you may be familiar with, argue it treats every new homeschool family as a suspect by default, which I can understand both viewpoints. Practically, if you're in Connecticut, this is the moment to get very clear on exactly what must be filled out, when, and with whom. And then start building simple, calm record-keeping habits now so you're not scrambling if guidance tightens later. So even though, I live in Texas, we don't have any record-keeping requirements. I keep records anyway. They're always good to have if someone calls CPS on you. They're always good to have if the guidance or the laws change in the future. They're also always good to have for co-ops or, college dual credit type classes if your kid wants to go and play for an NCAA school. And also just for your own record keeping and progress so they can kind of look back to where they were, what they've taken, what they've done. If you live elsewhere, if you live outside of Connecticut, this is still worth watching because laws in one state often become templates, whether they're good or bad, for others down the road. So don't just tune out just because this is Connecticut. This could impact you. Now, interestingly, story number two is about New Hampshire, which is right next to Connecticut. They're moving to loosen homeschool regulation. Connecticut is adding those guardrails, but New Hampshire lawmakers have been advancing a bill in the opposite direction. They call it the Home Education Freedom Act. The bill, which is House Bill 1268, has passed the House, cleared the Senate in some form. They made some adjustments to it. And as of late May, the House has concurred with the Senate's version, so they've sent it to the governor's desk. This measure would make homeschool notification optional, end the mandatory annual academic evaluations for homeschooled students they had previously, and eliminate the requirement to maintain portfolios or other records for state review. It also includes some language to prevent child welfare authorities from using a family's decision to homeschool or a lack of a school style paperwork as evidence of educational neglect by itself. If you're in New Hampshire, this bill would move you toward a high trust model. The state kind of is stepping back in this, and parents have a lot more freedom to design the education for their kiddos without reporting or testing requirements. Supporters, including the HSLDA and a lot of local families, argue this removes red tape while protecting families from investigations that are often rooted in bias against homeschooling, while some critics, including child advocates and lawmakers, they worry that by removing the notice and evaluation requirements, it makes it easier for some serious cases of neglect or abuse to remain hidden. So just for everybody, even outside of New Hampshire, this is another reminder that oversight can swing both ways. Some states are tightening, some are loosening, and the debates are often happening quietly in committee rooms long before they ever reach your social feed. So if this is something that you want to stay up to date in your state, I recommend becoming familiar with who your lawmakers are, what kind of committees there are. Get on a very well-known basis with your local representatives so you can send them email and say, how do you feel about this? Is there anything pending? Check in with your state legislators and see what bills are out there. This is something that's worth pursuing in your state. There are a lot of national advocacy groups that are paying close attention to the difference between how Connecticut and New Hampshire are kind of splitting in some ways. In fact, HSLDA, they had a recent news and updates piece that talked about Connecticut's move towards more regulation at the same time that New Hampshire is rolling it back. And they used headlines like striking, Connecticut moves to increase regs while New Hampshire removes them. So other people are paying attention to how kind of different this is falling depending on the state, and how close together these states are, in geography and politically, that they're still kind of splitting in this regard. They are also HSLDA, so if you want to keep up to date on other kinds of bills, they report on other bills around the country. There's several bills that are looking to increase requirements and to expand the access to public funds or recognition for homeschool graduates. One example of this was a federal homeschool graduation recognition act. We talked about this last month. It advanced to the U.S. Senate floor, which really aimed to clarify how federal programs recognize homeschool diplomas. Those details are still developing, but it is interesting how they're kind of wanting to formalize some of the homeschool process. At the same time, they're tracking some local disputes like districts adding extra steps before allowing withdrawals or colleges and employers misreading homeschool diplomas. HSLDA does a really good job at kind of keeping track of homeschool regulations that are kind of collectively painting a picture of some ongoing tension between systems built for traditional school and the reality of home education. So it's a great resource. I share these advocacy updates not to alarm you, but to underline the value of, again, knowing who in your state is watching legislation and helping translate it into plain language, and staying grounded in what the actual text of your state laws are, not just headlines or social media reactions. Like, you don't have to live on legislative websites, but knowing where to check when something pops up can save you a lot of stress, aggravation, and misinformation. One more quick story before we move on to some studies and research. Homeschool stories are showing up more often in mainstream lifestyle coverage, which has been really fun to see. There was a People magazine feature on parents homeschooling their children in a motorhome while traveling across Europe. There was a Business Insider story about a grandmother homeschooling her grandson, and they live in a tiny home on her property. These pieces aren't about law or policy, but they do shape how our neighbors, our extended families, our doctors, and lawmakers kind of picture homeschooling, either as creative, joyful learning, or something kind of fringe and questionable. So for those of us who are doing the day-to-day, the cultural narrative matters. And when we explain our choices at church, in the pediatrician's office, or a skeptical relative, we're really doing our part to better help inform the community, inform our friends, inform our professional interactions about what homeschooling can look like and what our kids are doing with it. Now, let's pivot to a few research highlights and what they might mean for your kitchen table lessons. Study number 1 was about executive functioning and early math growing kind of together. There was a 2025 study In NPJ Science of Learning, this is a Nature Partner journal. It looked at an intervention that deliberately wove executive function challenges, things like working memory, flexible thinking, self-control, things that a lot of younger kids and neurodivergent kids struggle with. They kind of put that in with early math activities. So researchers found that children who experienced this integrated program improved not just in their number skills, but also in how strongly their executive function skills and math abilities were connected afterward. The study suggests that instead of treating brain skills and math skills as kind of separate, distinct things, it can be powerful to design activities where kids are practicing both at once. For example, tasks that require comparing numbers, switching rules, or holding multiple pieces of information in mind while solving a problem. While this study was specifically about math and executive function, I don't think that this is a bad idea for executive function with other subjects as well. So if this is something that your kiddo struggles with, you might look at ways that you can kind of integrate some of the executive function skills that they may need to build with a subject that maybe they love, and that's one way to build the executive function skill with a subject that they already feel pretty confident in. You don't need a formal curriculum to borrow this idea. You can build this into what you're doing. There's a couple of suggestions here. You could build rule switching into math. So for example, we're skip counting by twos. Now switch to fives. Now only say the numbers that are multiples of three. You're switching the rule. Not rapid fire, but relatively quick enough that they're having to switch how their brain is functioning and how they're thinking of that. You can also use simple games where kids must remember a changing rule while solving math problems. So maybe things like Uno style reverse or skip layered onto card-based math facts. The big idea here is that every time your child has to hold rules in their mind, adapt to a change, and then still work with numbers or the subject that you're wanting to work on, you're helping those systems grow together. Study number 2, also about executive function. And also related to math. So zooming out, there was a 2025 review of research on executive function and math achievement, and they found that global executive function and its core components of working memory, control, cognitive flexibility, it has a statistically significant effect on how well students do in math. So children with stronger executive function skills tend to perform better in math even after accounting for other factors. Earlier work has shown a similar pattern that basically executive function measured around age 5, they predict math and reading performance in 5th grade, suggesting these self-management skills help some children catch up academically over time. For us, kind of the homeschool takeaway is that this research is a gentle nudge to pay attention not just to what our kids know, but how they're managing their learning. You can give your child practice planning and organizing their own work, like deciding what assignment to tackle first or how to break a project into steps, how to organize their work, how to organize their folders, what sections to have it in. These are some of the things that they kind of naturally do when they go to public school, right? They have to keep track of their homework to and from and know where they put it. But they don't, it's not something that's as common, at least in my own homeschool experience, that they're learning those skills. So giving your child that practice in the planning and organizing of their work can really be helpful in letting them build those executive function skills. You can also use low-stakes situations, things like board games, recipes, Lego instructions, right? The things that your kids like and want to do to kind of practice following multi-step directions, holding information in their mind, and then resisting that urge to rush or skip steps. These are everyday experiences, but they build the same muscles that show up later in things like algebra and beyond, even if they don't look like school. Study number 3 is about less structured time and kids' self-direction. This was an interesting one from some psychologists at University of Colorado and the University of Denver. They looked at how 6-year-olds spent their time over a week and then tested their self-directive executive function and their ability to set goals, make decisions, and regulate their own behavior. They found that children who spent more time in less structured activities, things like free play, reading by choice, or informal family activities, they showed more highly developed self-directed executive function than their peers whose time was much more heavily structured by the adults in their lives. In other words, kids seem to get better at directing themselves when they actually have practice deciding what to do and how to do it. So instead of always being slotted into these adult planned activities, they could better direct themselves when they had the freedom to explore and determine that for themselves. This obviously has some big implications for home education where we can offer more unstructured time. If you are a structured family, you can protect that daily space for genuine free play or deep dives into their interests without turning it into a checklist item. When possible, let your child choose the order of subjects or pick the project topic within a broad goal, any science topic you're curious about, for example. And then you can always coach them through planning it if they need a little bit of assistance and guidance. The truth is that doing nothing, that time is often where kids are practicing their focus, their creativity, their self regulation, those same skills that standardized tests claim to measure later on. Study number 4 and our last one is writing as a thinking tool in math and science. This one's a quick one. This was from Edutopia. Love Edutopia's coverage. They talk a lot about research and skills. They did a little piece on brain research. There was a neurologist named Judy Willis, and she's written how regular writing in math and science, things like explaining steps, making analogies, or keeping a learning journal, can help the brain process, store, and retrieve that complex information. She points out that writing can boost attention, reveal patterns, and support long-term memory, especially in upper elementary, all through the high school years. So for homeschoolers, that might mean, asking asking your teenager to write a short math diary entry once a week about a problem that stumped them, or having a middle schooler sketch and label the steps in a science process in their own words. It's less about perfect grammar and more about giving their brain time to organize ideas. This is also another thing that I think sometimes homeschoolers struggle a little bit more with is those note-taking skills. If your kiddo is not a note taker, you might offer them something like guided notes, where you write a sentence, but then you leave a couple of blanks that they can pull the words and fill it in as they're watching a video, for example. So that can kind of build that skill over time. That's what we started with. I had a kiddo who really struggled with note-taking, tried taking note-taking classes, tried teaching it. None of it really worked until we did a guided note process. And now he takes notes wonderfully and is the only student in his co-op class who does. So something to think about as you kind of explore not just literary stuff, but also math and science. If you're still listening while loading the dishwasher or sitting in the pickup line or grabbing groceries this week, here are some suggestions for things you can kind of do this week. You can take 5 minutes to look up the current homeschool law in your state, especially if you're, something's going on. Just a quick check. You don't need to do a deep dive. And maybe pick one small research-inspired experiment, maybe a rule-switching math game or giving your kiddo a bit more say over how they spend their afternoon. Just notice what happens. And if there's an article, a bill, or a study that has you wondering, send it my way. You can find us at homeschoolce.substack.com. I'm not perfect. I'm not a lawyer or a neuroscientist. I'm just a mom here in the trenches with you, paying attention and asking questions. Before we wrap up, let me plant some seeds for future episodes that grow out of today's stories and studies. If you would be interested in learning more about some other things, please send us a message at homeschoolce.substack.com. We would love to hear more about what you would like to hear about. Thanks again for listening to Continuing Education, a podcast for homeschooling families. Until next time.